At 11:43 this morning, Westminster did something it hasn't done in over 3 centuries. A vote so rare, so constitutionally explosive, that even the Speaker's hands trembled as he read the final tally. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle have just been formally exiled from Britain, and the fallout has already begun, the vote that shattered everything. The chamber fell silent in a way that happens perhaps once in a generation. Members of Parliament, usually rowdy and combative during votes, sat frozen as the Speaker of the House stood at the dispatch box. His voice, typically steady and authoritative, trembled slightly as he announced the numbers. 347 votes in favor, 216 against. The motion to formally exile Prince Harry and Meghan Markle from British soil had passed with a majority that stunned even those who had campaigned for it. For a moment, nothing moved. Then the chamber erupted, not with cheers or jeers, but with something far more unsettling. A low murmur that spread like wildfire through the benches, a collective exhale of disbelief mixed with grim satisfaction. Outside, in the cold December air, reporters who had been stationed at Westminster since dawn began shouting into their phones. Within 90 seconds, every major news outlet on the planet had broken into regular programming. For years, American commentators had suggested that Britain was too polite to take drastic action. However, today proved them wrong. What made this vote so devastating wasn't just the outcome, it was the speed. The motion had been introduced only 6 days earlier, debated behind closed doors for 72 hours, and brought to the floor with almost no public warning. That alone violated nearly every convention of parliamentary procedure. Exile motions, when they exist at all in modern history, take months of deliberation. This one moved like a guillotine, swift and final. Inside Downing Street, the Prime Minister's aides scrambled to coordinate responses with Buckingham Palace. The timing had been deliberate. The vote occurred while King Charles was attending a private engagement in Scotland, ensuring he could not be accused of directly influencing Parliament. William was at Windsor, his schedule carefully cleared. Anne was in Edinburgh. The entire senior royal family had positioned themselves away from London, a choreographed absence that spoke louder than any statement could. But the most telling reaction came from those who had pushed hardest for this outcome. Senior Conservative MPs, many representing constituencies where public anger toward the Sussexes had grown toxic, expressed quiet relief rather than triumph. One backbencher, speaking anonymously to a news correspondent, said simply, "This wasn't about punishment, it was about survival." The monarchy cannot function while 2 of its former members wage war from abroad. That phrase, wage war, would dominate headlines for the rest of the day. Across the Atlantic in Montecito, California, the Sussexes were waking to a nightmare they had been warned about but refused to believe was possible. According to sources close to their circle, Meghan saw the alert first. She had been checking her phone during breakfast when the breaking news banner appeared. For several seconds, she simply stared. Then she handed the phone to Harry without saying a word. Not because the vote was surprising, but because it was real, irreversible, final. The legal implications were immediate and severe. Under the terms of the motion, both Harry and Meghan would be prohibited from entering the United Kingdom for a minimum of 10 years, with potential extensions subject to parliamentary review. Any attempt to return would result in immediate arrest and deportation. Their British properties, including Frogmore Cottage, would be seized by the Crown Estate. Their remaining ceremonial titles, already stripped of function, would be formally nullified. Even their children, Archie and Lilibet, would face restrictions on travel to Britain until they reached adulthood and could petition independently. By noon, Buckingham Palace released a statement so brief it felt almost cruel. "The matter is one for Parliament and the government. The royal family will continue to focus on its duties." 21 words. However, to understand how we arrived at this moment, we have to go back to the weeks when the storm was still gathering, before anyone outside Westminster's inner circles knew how close Britain was to taking the most extreme step in modern royal history. The secret meetings that led here. The first indication that something unprecedented was forming came in early November, when a small group of MPs received invitations to a private briefing at the Cabinet Office. The meeting was listed in official logs as a security consultation, vague enough to avoid media attention. Those who attended included senior members of the Home Affairs Committee, representatives from the intelligence services, and a handful of constitutional advisors whose expertise lay in the murky intersection of monarchy and state power. What they were shown that evening changed everything. Intelligence reports compiled over the previous 8 months detailed a pattern of activity that alarmed even those accustomed to Sussex controversies. The briefing included evidence of coordinated media campaigns aimed at undermining specific members of the royal family, particularly Catherine. It outlined financial relationships between Sussex-affiliated PR firms and outlets known for spreading misinformation. Most troubling were communications suggesting that Harry and Meghan's team had been in contact with foreign media organizations to discuss potential documentary projects that, in the words of one analyst, would destabilize the institution from abroad. None of this was illegal in the traditional sense. But for a nation where the monarchy functions as a constitutional cornerstone, the implications were severe. One MP present at the briefing later described the atmosphere as a funeral. "We weren't dealing with tabloid drama anymore," he said off the record. "We were looking at something that could fracture the relationship between Crown and Parliament if left unchecked." The second meeting occurred 3 weeks later, this time at a secure location within Westminster itself. By now, the circle had widened slightly to include senior figures from both major parties. The bipartisan nature of the group was itself extraordinary. In modern British politics, agreement across party lines on anything controversial is rare. But the Sussex situation had become something else entirely, a constitutional threat that transcended regular political divisions. William played a role in this process, though his involvement was carefully insulated from direct visibility. He did not attend meetings. He did not lobby MPs personally. But his private secretary delivered a series of briefings to key parliamentary figures, outlining the palace's concerns and, critically, making clear that the royal family would not oppose a legislative solution. That last point was essential. Without it, Parliament would never have dared move forward. Princess Anne contributed in her own way. During a private dinner with several senior cabinet ministers in late November, she remarked that one attendee described it as chilling in its clarity. "Institutions survive," she said, "by knowing when to amputate." She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Everyone present understood that she was speaking about Harry and Meghan, and that the royal family, historically cautious about direct political engagement, was now quietly endorsing the most extreme option available. In early December, a subcommittee investigating foreign influence operations issued a report that, almost as a footnote, mentioned British nationals engaged in media activities that could be interpreted as destabilizing the constitutional structures of a key American ally. The report didn't name Harry and Meghan explicitly. However, the report landed on the desk of the British Home Secretary within hours of its release, and it changed the calculation entirely. What had been viewed as a domestic royal drama was now entangled with international relations and national security concerns. When foreign governments begin questioning whether former royals are acting in ways that complicate diplomatic relationships, the situation moves beyond tabloid fodder into territory that demands governmental response. The drafting of the Exile motion began in absolute secrecy. A small team of parliamentary lawyers worked with constitutional historians to craft language that would withstand legal challenge. The precedent they relied on was obscure, dating back to 1703, when Parliament had last exercised its authority to formally banish individuals deemed threats to the realm's stability. The mechanism had never been used against royals, but it existed. And in Britain's unwritten constitution, existence is often enough. By the first week of December, the motion was ready. The decision to move quickly, to compress months of standard procedure into days, was strategic. Delay would mean leaks, and leaks would mean media firestorms, public pressure, and potential intervention by parties that could complicate the vote. Speed was not cruelty, it was survival. The final sign that the vote was inevitable came when the palace made a decision that stunned even seasoned observers. King Charles authorized the release of private correspondence between himself and Harry, messages dating back 18 months that showed the king repeatedly warning his son about the consequences of continued public attacks on the family. That release, orchestrated by carefully selected journalists, dramatically shifted public sentiment. Polls conducted in the 48 hours before the vote showed a sharp increase in support for intense parliamentary action. Older voters, particularly those over 50, expressed overwhelming approval. Even among younger demographics, previously more sympathetic to the Sussexes, support for exile measures reached 42%. By the morning of the vote, the outcome was no longer in doubt, with only the margin remaining. And when that margin proved larger than even optimistic projections had suggested, it sent a message not just to Harry and Meghan, but to anyone watching from abroad. Britain had finally reached its limit, and the patience that had allowed the Sussexes to attack, retreat, and attack again had finally expired. What Harry and Meghan failed to understand, what they perhaps could never understand from their California refuge, was that they had misread the temperature of an entire royal family, and what was coming next would be more devastating than anyone could possibly imagine. What Harry and Meghan didn't see coming. Throughout late autumn, sources close to the Sussexes described a household operating under the belief that their position was secure. Meghan, in particular, seemed confident that public opinion, especially in America, would shield them from any serious consequences. She had built a narrative over 3 years that positioned them as victims of an archaic, racist institution. That narrative had resonated powerfully with specific demographics, particularly younger Americans and progressive media outlets. But what she failed to account for was that narratives, no matter how compelling, eventually collide with more complex realities. Harry's position was more complicated. Unlike Meghan, he had grown up inside the system. He understood its mechanisms, its pressures, its capacity for coldness when threatened. Yet somewhere along the way, that understanding had curdled into contempt. Friends who knew him before his marriage described a man who had always chafed against royal constraints but never truly believed the institution would turn on him. He was born royal. That, he thought, granted him a permanent immunity that Meghan, as an outsider, could never fully claim. The first missed warning came in October when several of their key media allies in Britain began quietly stepping back from coverage of Sussex. These weren't tabloids or hostile outlets. They were journalists who had previously championed the couple, written sympathetic profiles, and defended them against criticism. But one by one, they started declining interview requests, pulling back from Sussex-related stories, and in some cases, privately expressing concern that the narrative had become too toxic to touch. One such journalist, speaking months later under condition of anonymity, explained the shift. "We started hearing things from inside Parliament. Not rumors, but concrete information that something significant was being discussed. And when you're a reporter who values access, you have to make calculations." Continuing to champion Harry and Meghan meant risking relationships with sources inside government and the palace. For many of us, that trade-off no longer made sense. The second warning arrived in the form of legal communications. In early November, Harry's British legal team received a formal notification from the Home Office requesting clarification on several points related to his residency status, security arrangements, and ongoing litigation against UK media outlets. The language was bureaucratic, almost mundane, but the subtext was clear. The government was reviewing his standing, and the review was not routine. Harry's response was to instruct his lawyers to push back aggressively, treating the inquiry as another example of institutional harassment. Meghan, according to those present during strategy discussions, encouraged this approach. She viewed any sign of retreat as validation of the palace's tactics. What neither of them understood was that the Home Office inquiry wasn't harassment. It was preparation. The government was laying groundwork for actions that would require detailed legal justification, and Harry's combative response only made the eventual outcome easier to defend. The third warning should have been impossible to miss. In late November, William authorized a rare interview with a senior political correspondent. The interview, ostensibly about his increased royal duties, included a single line that went largely unnoticed by the general public, but sent shockwaves among those who understood royal communication. "There comes a point," William said carefully, "when protecting the institution requires difficult decisions that previous generations avoided." He didn't mention Harry. He didn't need to. Everyone knew exactly what he meant. Yet in California, the reaction was dismissal. Meghan told friends that William was posturing, trying to appear decisive for a British public that was losing faith in the monarchy's relevance. Harry, meanwhile, seemed to interpret the comment as further evidence of his brother's ambition and willingness to sacrifice family for power. Neither of them considered the possibility that William was not threatening. He was informed. The decision had already been made. The gears were already turning. Harry and Meghan's response was delivered through their PR team. They would not be silenced. They would not apologize for speaking the truth, and they would not negotiate with a system designed to suppress them. The intermediary, upon receiving this response, reportedly closed the communication channel and told associates, "They have no idea what's coming." On the morning of December 3rd, as MPs filed into Westminster to cast their votes, Harry and Meghan were in California, operating under the assumption that this was simply another chapter in an ongoing drama. However, when the vote passed, the shock was absolute. Not because they hadn't known emotion existed. By that point, rumors had reached even their carefully controlled information bubble, but because they had convinced themselves it would fail. That Britain, for all its bluster, would never actually exile a prince and his American wife. That the international embarrassment would be too great. That Charles, despite everything, would intervene on his son's behalf. They were wrong on every count. And as the reality settled in over the hours following the vote, a different emotion began to replace shock. Not regret, not yet, but something colder. The recognition that they had burned bridges so thoroughly that there was no path back, not through apology, not through time, not through any mechanism they could imagine. For the first time since leaving Britain in 2020, Harry and Meghan faced a future with no contingency plan, no escape route, and no certainty about what came next: the constitutional earthquake. What happened in Westminster on December 3rd was not merely political theater. It was a constitutional event of a magnitude that legal scholars will debate for decades. The vote to exile Harry and Meghan activated mechanisms that most people assumed had been relegated to history books, dusted off from centuries past and applied to two individuals who, in the eyes of Parliament, had crossed a line no modern royal had dared approach. The legal foundation for the exile rests on a peculiar feature of British constitutional law. Unlike nations with written constitutions that clearly delineate powers, Britain operates on a system of parliamentary sovereignty combined with centuries of precedent. This means that, in theory, Parliament can pass almost any law it chooses, provided it can muster the votes. That statute, originally designed to address threats to the realm during periods of political instability, granted Parliament the authority to banish individuals whose actions were deemed incompatible with the nation's security and constitutional stability. The language was deliberately vague, a product of an era when specificity in law was seen as a weakness. Modern legal interpretation had assumed such powers were defunct, overridden by contemporary human rights frameworks. The December vote proved otherwise. The Home Office moved with extraordinary speed to implement the decision. Within 6 hours of the vote, formal notices were dispatched to Harry and Meghan through their legal representatives. The documents, running to 47 pages, outlined the precise terms of their exile. Entry into the United Kingdom was prohibited for a minimum period of 10 years. Any attempt to enter by any means would result in immediate detention and forcible removal. Their British passports, though not technically revoked, were flagged in international databases, alerting immigration officials worldwide to their status. Property seizure followed with equal efficiency. Frogmore Cottage, the Windsor estate property that had been their UK residence, was formally reclaimed by the Crown Estate before sunset. Personal belongings were catalogued, packed, and placed in secure storage pending arrangements for international shipping. Security stripping proved more complex. Harry had been fighting in British courts for years to maintain taxpayer-funded police protection during UK visits. That battle became instantly moot. All security provisions were terminated with immediate effect. More significantly, intelligence sharing between British and American security services regarding threats against the Sussexes was suspended. This didn't mean they were left completely vulnerable. American private security could still function, but it severed a connection that had provided critical threat assessment information. The financial implications rippled outward in ways that would take months to calculate fully. Harry's remaining inheritance from his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, held in trust and scheduled for release at future intervals, was frozen pending legal review. Constitutional experts struggled to find modern parallels. The closest comparison was Edward VIII, but his abdication in 1936 was voluntary, and his subsequent exile, though real, was never formalized through parliamentary vote. What made the Sussex case unprecedented was the combination of parliamentary action, royal acquiescence, and the application of legal mechanisms most scholars believed had been consigned to historical curiosity. International law added another layer of complexity. Could Britain legally exile its own citizens? The answer, surprisingly, was yes, though the mechanisms were ancient and rarely invoked. But Harry's situation was complicated by his California residency and Meghan's American citizenship. The United States, while maintaining diplomatic silence in the immediate aftermath, faced its own questions. Would it recognize the exile order? Would it limit the Sussexes' activities if British officials argued they were conducting operations harmful to an allied nation? The European Convention on Human Rights, which Britain remained bound by despite Brexit, provided potential grounds for legal challenge. The right to enter one's own country is considered fundamental under international human rights law. But British legal advisors had anticipated this. The exile wasn't technically preventing Harry from entering Britain forever. It was imposing a time-limited restriction based on parliamentary assessment of constitutional necessity. That distinction, narrow as it might seem, provided just enough legal cover to withstand immediate challenge. By the evening of December 3rd, as legal filings began piling up in London courts, one reality had crystallized. Whatever happened next, whether the exile stood or fell under legal review, the relationship between the British state and the Duke and Duchess of Sussex had been fundamentally altered. For Prince Harry, the deepest cut wasn't legal or financial. It was existential. He had been born into an identity that could never be entirely shed. And now, for the first time in his life, that identity had been forcibly severed from the only country that could validate it. He could call himself Prince Harry anywhere in the world, but without Britain, the title became hollow and a costume with no stage. The royal family's cold silence. Inside Buckingham Palace, the hours following the parliamentary vote unfolded with a stillness that felt almost rehearsed. No emergency meetings, no frantic phone calls, no visible crisis management. Staff moved through their routines with the precision of people who had been prepared for this outcome long before it arrived. And in the private apartments where the senior royals resided, the response was marked not by shock, but by something far more unsettling: relief. King Charles remained in Scotland throughout the day, his schedule unchanged. He attended a planned visit to a Highland community project, spoke briefly with local officials, and returned to Balmoral by late afternoon. Those who observed him noted no visible distress, no moments of hesitation. His face carried the same composed exhaustion it had worn for months. If he grieved for his son, he did so behind doors no staff member would dare approach. But Charles's silence was deliberate, crafted in consultation with advisors who understood that any public emotion would be weaponized. If he expressed sorrow, he would be accused of weakness. If he showed relief, he would be condemned as cruel. So he said nothing, allowed the parliamentary vote to stand on its own terms, and by doing so, signaled that the institution had moved beyond the point where Harry's fate required royal commentary. William's response was colder still. He spent the day at Windsor, working through a revised schedule of engagements that would now fall more heavily on his shoulders. When a private secretary brought news of the vote's final tally, William reportedly nodded once, said nothing, and returned to the document he had been reviewing. For him, the exile was not a family tragedy, it was a problem solved. The monarchy could not function while Harry and Meghan lobbied for a tax from California. Now, finally, there was clarity. Catherine, for her part, felt a complex mix of emotions, described by those close to her as sadness layered over pragmatism. She had tried, in the early years, to build a relationship with Meghan. Those efforts had been rebuffed, dismissed, and later weaponized in interviews that painted Catherine as cold and unwelcoming. Princess Anne spent the day in Edinburgh, attending to her royal duties with the same relentless efficiency she brought to every task. When asked by a member of her staff how she felt about the parliamentary decision, Anne offered a response that would later leak to the press and define much of the public conversation. Institutions endure by making hard choices. Today, Parliament made one. She did not elaborate. She rarely did. But the message was unmistakable. Anne viewed the exile not as punishment, but as a necessity. Queen Camilla, whose position had always been complicated by her own history, chose a different path. She issued no statements, attended no events, and remained at Clarence House throughout the day. But those who knew her well understood that Camilla, more than any other senior royal, recognized the dangerous precedent being set. If Parliament could exile Harry for threatening the monarchy's stability, what protections existed for others should political winds shift? Her silence was not approved. It was a caution. The palace's official statement, released at 14:30, was remarkable only for its brevity. The matter decided by Parliament today is a constitutional question outside the scope of royal commentary. The family's focus remains on service to the nation. 29 words. No mention of Harry by name. No expression of regret or support. Just a clinical acknowledgement that the situation had been removed from the family's domain and placed squarely in the hands of the state. But behind that public silence, private calculations were already underway. Charles's advisors began reviewing protocols for future succession planning, ensuring that Harry's exile would not create legal ambiguities regarding the line of succession. William's team coordinated with government officials on messaging strategies, anticipating a prolonged media focus on the family's role in enabling the parliamentary vote. And across all levels of the royal household, staff prepared for the inevitable backlash from Sussex supporters who would frame the exile as proof of institutional cruelty. International reactions complicated the silence. American media, particularly outlets sympathetic to the Sussexes, depicted the royal family as complicit in a medieval punishment. CNN ran segments questioning whether the British monarchy had any place in a modern democratic society. The New York Times published an op-ed arguing that the exile revealed the institution's inherent toxicity. For the palace, these attacks were expected, even anticipated. The strategy was simple: let the noise rage, offer no defense, and allow time to dull the outrage. Yet within this orchestrated silence, small cracks appeared. King Charles, during a private evening at Balmoral, was observed standing alone at a window overlooking the estate grounds, his expression unreadable. Prince William, too, showed fleeting moments of something beneath his composed exterior. During a private conversation with Catherine, overheard accidentally by a staff member passing in the corridor, he reportedly said, "I didn't want it to come to this, but he left us no choice." It was the closest he came to expressing any ambivalence about the outcome, and even then the emphasis was on necessity, not regret. The silence from Buckingham Palace, Windsor, and Balmoral in the days following the vote sent a message more powerful than any statement could convey. For Harry, watching from California as his family remained silent, the message was clear. He was no longer a problem they were trying to solve. He was no longer a son, a brother, a family member whose welfare concerned them. He had become, in the coldest possible sense, irrelevant to their future. And that irrelevance, more than the exile itself, was the actual severance. The final proof that the bridges he had burned could never be rebuilt. The long shadow ahead. As the winter sun set over Montecito on December 3rd, Harry and Meghan faced a future more uncertain than any moment since their departure from royal life in 2020. The exile vote had not simply closed a door. It had sealed an entire corridor of possibilities they had assumed would always remain open. No matter how hostile the relationship became, they had believed on some level that return was always an option. That belief died at 11:43 that morning in Westminster. The immediate practical consequences were staggering. Travel became complicated in ways they hadn't anticipated. While both held valid passports, Harry's flagged status meant that every international border crossing would now involve additional scrutiny. Countries with extradition agreements or close intelligence cooperation with Britain might view him as a security complication. Invitations to events in Europe, previously routine, would now require careful vetting by hosts worried about diplomatic fallout. Financial pressures, already significant, intensified. The couple's income model had relied heavily on their royal connection, their ability to tell insider stories, and their positioning as truth-tellers exposing institutional dysfunction. But exile changed the narrative equation. They were no longer brave whistleblowers. They were exiled former royals, a category that historically generates more pity than profit. Netflix, Spotify, and other media partners would need to reassess whether the Sussex brand still carries the commercial value it once did. For their children, Archie and Lilibet, the implications stretched across decades. Both held dual citizenship, American and British. But the exile order, while not legally binding on them, created a chilling effect. Would they be welcomed in Britain as adults, or would their parents' status cast a permanent shadow over them? Could they build relationships with cousins, with grandparents, with the extended family they had been photographed with as infants but might never honestly know? The psychological impact would reveal itself more slowly, but those who understood trauma recognized the signs immediately. Harry had spent 40 years defined by his royal identity, even when rebelling against it. That identity shaped his sense of purpose, his public role, and his understanding of who he was in the world. Without Britain, without the palace, without the institution he spent years attacking, who was he? Meghan's position was different, but no less complicated. She had entered the royal family as an outsider, endured treatment she described as racist and cruel, and built a second act around exposing that treatment. The exile could be framed in certain circles as vindication, proof that the institution was exactly as toxic as she had claimed. But that narrative had limits. Exile also meant failure, an inability to navigate a system that, however flawed, many women before her had managed to survive. And in Hollywood, where success matters more than righteousness, failure is rarely forgiven. International implications extended beyond the couple themselves. The United States government, maintaining public neutrality, faced quiet pressure from British diplomats to limit Sussex activities that could be interpreted as hostile to an allied nation. While outright restrictions were unlikely, the message was clear. If Harry and Meghan continued producing content attacking the British monarchy or government, there would be diplomatic consequences. Soft power has limits even for American citizens married to exiled princes. Yet within this bleak landscape, one possibility remained, not as royals, not as victims, but as something entirely new. History offered rare examples of public figures who survived exile and built meaningful second acts. But those success stories required something Harry and Meghan had not yet demonstrated, the ability to stop looking backward. For the British monarchy, the long-term implications were equally uncertain. The exile had solved an immediate problem. Harry and Meghan could no longer destabilize the institution from within its orbit, but it had created new vulnerabilities. International criticism of the decision was fierce and sustained. Younger generations, particularly outside Britain, viewed the exile as proof that the monarchy was outdated, vindictive, and incapable of evolving. Those perceptions would take years to shift, if they shifted at all. Prince William, now the unambiguous heir without a wayward brother complicating the succession narrative, faced a different kind of pressure. He would be judged not only on his own merits, but on whether the institution he would one day lead could justify the coldness it had displayed toward Harry. Every decision, every public appearance, every statement would be scrutinized through the lens of that severed relationship. The Crown had chosen survival over compassion. As December deepened into the darkest days of winter, a truth settled over everyone touched by the exile vote. This was not an ending. It was a threshold, the beginning of a long, uncertain period during which Harry and Meghan would define who they could become without the identity they had spent years attacking but never fully released. And the monarchy would discover whether it could thrive in a world where exile, once a relic of history, had become a tool of modern constitutional governance. Thank you for watching. The exile of Harry and Meghan is not simply a royal drama. It is a reminder that consequences, however long delayed, eventually arrive. See you in the next video.